lunch that was. Was that you, Saman, that got that lunch together, or Kalyan? Well, anyway, lunch. The other thing I would like to request is if we could have people move more down, just take a minute to move down so that we can have an actual conversation. Come on down. Look, yes, people are moving. Okay, so more people are coming down, great. But I don't want to take up too much time with this. So it is my great honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, who is Cathy Casserly, who is currently an independent strategist working with the Hewlett Foundation. But I first met Cathy, actually when you were an independent consultant at that time too, and then later the Hewlett Foundation had the wisdom to bring her on as a program officer. And this was back in 2002, where she had the foresight to be the original funder of the Open Learning Initiative at Carnegie Mellon University. And then after working at the Hewlett Foundation, really leading the OER strategy along with Mike Smith for a number of years, she became CEO of Creative Commons. And now she is back again being an independent consultant. But when we were thinking about who should we ask to give expertise around open educational resources, I could think of no one more perfect than Cathy Casserly.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction. I've known Candace a long time, along with some familiar faces I see in the audience, so it'll be fun to reconnect. So I am honored to be here to speak about openness and talk about the MOOCs as well, because there's really been a long journey in the open educational resources space, and it continues to evolve, and I think there's parallel tracks with the MOOC world as well. So just to give a little bit of a roadmap, I want to talk a little bit about the goals for the talk so we can all kind of be in the same field. So I want to talk a little bit about the early vision and the motivation regarding open educational resources, where it came from, some lessons learned, and where it's evolved. And then really talk a little bit about open licensing. Candace was really clear when I spoke to her about this talk that everyone maybe not be familiar with open licensing, and that would be an important thing to make sure I was able to contribute to the conversation. And also the growth of the OER movement, where it began and where it is now, just not in the United States, but certainly globally. To talk about how MOOCs fit with the OER movement. Where is the fit? Where is the overlap? Where isn't there fit? Is this something in a different world, in a different kind of vector as it takes off? And to talk about MOOCs, openness, higher education in the future. Everyone's talking about it, just to really try to summarize where I think things are going and where the possibilities and the potential is overall. So I'm going to start back in 2001. Candace is right. I've cycled through these independent consulting gigs periodically. I find them freeing, and this is one of those moments. And I joined, so I guess part of the story is Mike Smith is here, and I can't see him. There he is. And Mike Smith joined Hewlett in 2001 as the program director for education. And as he was thinking about where he would spend his tenure at Hewlett, he realized there was not an education technology portfolio. That hadn't been an area of investment typically for Hewlett. It was the end of the dot-com bubble. It had burst. But where was and how would technology play an important role in education? And there's some of the early players as well. So the question was, Cathy, can you come on and just help out a little bit? Let's think about where we can spend some time in the technology space. And as I fast forward through the story, I won't fast forward through all the different projects we funded. We spent a lot of time thinking about efficacy. We thought a lot of time about thinking about research, because what we needed to know, which is what we still need to know today, is what works in the education and online environment. But we also knew that if we were going to invest in some significant random designs at that time, by 5 years later, when the design and the data were back, the technology was changing so fast, it would be essentially irrelevant. So we went through a process of really trying to figure out where would we invest and what would it look like. And one of the projects that came to Hewlett and under Mike's leadership, and then mine as a program officer and then initiative director really helped manage and lead, is the MIT OpenCourseWare. So Chuck Fest, president of MIT, came to Hewlett along with Mellon Foundation to support and asked the Hewlett Foundation to fund this idea that MIT would put its course materials out available for the world to be able to see and to reuse and to repurpose. And so this was the Big Bang. Those of you who were here at that time, it was like the Big Bang in the knowledge universe. That's what it was called. I see Vijay Kumar and Shigeru Magawa, who were MIT faculty, who sat around the table in those early days as we talked about the beginning of what this OpenCourseWare venture would look like and what it would mean for the world in sharing. And the big piece of this was that this was an institution, an elite institution that was opening its window, but very clearly not its door, so that others could peer in and see what was inside the ivory tower. And it was huge because the thirst for what happens inside MIT is enormous. And there was take-up, very much like MOOCs. The interest, particularly outside the United States, was strong, but what we also learned in the early days that there were a lot of workers, employees in Silicon Valley who wanted to keep up on technology. So the draw into the materials that were OpenCourseWare were fascinating. But at Hewlett, that was one core project, but we were still continuing to think about what would the field look like. So we were speaking with Carnegie Mellon, and we were meeting with them fairly regularly, and they were doing this great work in cognitive science, and we were thinking about learning design, and out of that emerged the Carnegie Mellon Open Learning Initiative. So it was another type of a project. It wasn't just courseware, but it really is scaffold learning in all the ways that we know open learning has been so successful. We funded lots of projects. I'm just going to showcase a few of them. At Rice University, we funded a project called Connections, which is now morphed into OpenStacks. And in the early days, Connections was really just small bundles of knowledge that faculty or students could bundle in ways that made sense for them based on their prior knowledge so that they could kind of weave their own flexible and adaptable path through education. We tried to rely on networks. We didn't need to build from scratch. Always in the very beginning, it was what networks might we be able to harness who would see the value proposition of open educational resources. UNESCO has a huge network, and in 2002, they convened a meeting at their headquarters. And because at that time, we wanted to know, does this idea make sense? Is there traction? If we build it, will people come? And the resounding response that we received at that meeting was there was an incredible thirst, particularly from the global south, who did not have access to the textbooks, to the materials. And we heard clearly that there was an interest and a thirst from the leaders and the education leaders of the countries. And there was a second thing we heard clearly, is that this was not to be just content that would come in materials from the north to the south, but the south readily wanted to contribute back and to engage in this process. And that is something that I think we've heard early, and we've tried to hold true at the same time. So it's really a collaborative learning environment. We relied on organizations like the Commonwealth of Learning, which has the virtual university of the small states, which began to build out OER and has been a huge champion. We funded OECD to conduct studies of the surveys to understand where the traction was with open education. We funded the Open University of the UK, who were the premier distance-based organization at that time, who had been in kind of blending both online and face-to-face, or distance at that time, and face-to-face instruction. They built cohorts together. They served non-traditional students. They didn't require that you had a high school degree, and yet they brought students through a continuum and have been a huge server of higher education in the UK. We had to start some new organizations. Monterey Institute for Technology and Education was one that really focused on the K-12 space. ISKME, which is the Institute for Study of Knowledge Management and Education, began to develop the OER Commons because we needed a place to be able to find the content. And the search and the ability to locate content and discoverability still continues to be an issue. We funded OER Africa because the hub certainly couldn't just be in the United States. It had to be global, and we needed local entities to be able to really support the movement. And at that same time, which we weren't quite aware, we decided early on that there were lots of things we could do in education technology, but we were going to focus on content. And we weren't going to worry about hardwiring schools, other places, other people would take care of that. And we hadn't really had on our radar in a significant way the IP issues, but it became very clear quickly into the grants. At MIT, I think there was some of the grant funding was to deal with the intellectual property issue, and I know the OU UK tells a story that there was a line item for $125K for their lawyers to figure out the intellectual property. But what happened at the same time, Creative Commons was being born. And so what we heard is, hey, there's someone down the street down there at Stanford, this guy Larry Lessig, and there's other co-founders. One of them is Hal Abelson, who actually works in this building. And they're trying to think about the sharing space, so you should go talk with them. So that was one organization that Hewlett supported in the early days. So when Candace asked me about this talk, she said, go back to the early days and what you were thinking about. And for me, so this is my perspective, this was a very early theory of change model. It was from April 2004. It's what we used for our board to justify some of our investments. And we really kind of simplified the model. And the end goal was really thinking about equalizing access to education, to really level the playing field so that no matter where you were geographically or what your financial constraints were, you would have the opportunity, if you had internet connection, to be able to access this knowledge, and this knowledge which should be of very high quality. So we kind of very much started a bit on the supply side of really trying to develop high quality open content. We knew that there were key areas that had to be addressed. We had to remove barriers to the use of the content. We had to make sure it was facilitated and easy to use. And we had to understand and stimulate use. There were many feedback loops at different points, but all of this was really a cycle of how we tried to learn about the space and continue to promote the growth. So as you think about open educational resources, one of the most important pieces that you need to think about is what the open licensing is. So this is an incredibly important part of it. So I'm just going to tell a little bit story about kind of intellectual property in the internet to understand where OER gets housed. So before 2002, there were really just both ends of that spectrum. There was copyright. Anytime we create anything, anytime a creator, you, I, an institution, creates anything in a tangible medium, it is automatically copyrighted. Whether it's a paragraph, whether it's a squiggle design, whether it's a painting, whether it's a lesson plan, whether it's a textbook, things get automatically copyrighted. We don't actually have to put that C stamp on the document or whatever it might be. The other spectrum is you can put things into the public domain and you can let people know that they're in the public domain. So there was really this two-end opportunity. Either everything's under copyright or things can be in the public domain. But then along comes the internet, and now there's space for sharing, copies everywhere, right? And how did the law begin to keep up with the technology and with the internet? And it really wasn't happening. There was no way for sharers to let the world know what they wanted. And that's really the space where Creative Commons was born. And the idea is you can share. You, the creator, have the freedom to choose, only if you want, whether way you want to share it with the world. And if you do want to share it with the world, you can use an open license, and one of the global standards for open licenses is Creative Commons. There are different versions of Creative Commons licenses. It's also part of the story of the evolution of the organization. At one time, it had up to 12, way too confusing, got it down to 6, stable form that continues today. The first one is just that little emblem, which is all of the licenses have to have attribution. Whoever the creator is has to be attributed. But there's variations on it. The first one is called Creative Commons by, which means you put it out to the world and you can let anyone use it in any way they want. They just need to attribute you, the creator. The second license with the little share-alike is the one that Wikipedia uses. You can take it, you can reuse it, revise, remix, but you've got to put that new product back into the world so others can also build on it in the future. The next one is non-commercial. Anyone can use it, but if they can't use it for commercial purposes. If they want to use it for commercial purposes, they have to find you, and you have to negotiate an agreement. And the last one is just no derivatives. It stays the same within kind of the print version of it. So these licenses were born, and there was incredible take-up, particularly in the early days among the bloggers and the photographers. A lot of the culture community really understood the value of the licenses. So when we talk about open licensing and OER, we're talking about free, right? And here we mean free, it's no cost. There's no cost to use, to access the content, to download it, etc. But secondly, and this is a really important piece, is that there's permission. You automatically have permission to reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute. So you can take that content and materials and you can build on it and you can learn from it and you can translate. Translation has always been an important piece of it. And in the OER community, there's really some important shared values, that knowledge is a public good, that open can deliver equal or better quality resources at a lower cost, that everyone can contribute, it's not just the few, and that the continuous improvement cycle is really critical around open resources to improve teaching and learning. And so we're really trying to focus on the learning outcomes. So one of the pieces as the space has evolved is not to think about OER just as a product. It's a process. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of teaching, and it's a way of learning. And I think the conversation about this has grown, particularly as the movement has grown. And really in the goals, while we implicitly previously thought about teaching and learning, it wasn't always explicit. These are the goals that come from the community, particularly from Hewlett at this point, to equalize access to knowledge for teachers and students around the globe, and to improve the practices of teaching and learning through this process. So in the early days, there were not as many funders. The idea has gained traction. I don't necessarily need to go through all of these, but one thing I want to call out is just kind of this TAC, which is in the middle, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Community Act. And it was really $2 billion. This was early in the Obama administration, and it was $2 billion for community colleges to develop high-quality courseware to help retrain workers. But the thing that was unusual is the solicitation included a requirement that the content that gets generated and developed carries a Creative Commons license. So then the Gates Foundation supported Creative Commons to make sure we provided the technical assistance to the community colleges to really understand what that meant and to be applying the IP appropriately. And so there's the idea now and the understanding that once you invest in these materials, you don't always have to start from scratch. You can actually build on the materials that exist and move ahead. So there's been policy decisions that have happened in British Columbia, in California, some open textbooks as well. UK has picked up on this in a very significant way. Their Council of Higher Education just has done a lot of research on it. IDRC in Canada, the research funding group, has invested in OER studies, particularly in the Global South. The European Commission is investing both in UNESCO and some MOOCs that I'll talk about later. In the bottom right corner is a research group out of Seville, which is doing research on MOOCs as well. So this has really become a global phenomena. This is really just showing some of the projects that exist, certainly not just here in the United States. So I think while we sit at MIT, and I think MIT is just such a hub of activity, there's the whole world. We're in a microcosm here, and the whole world is out there. And there's a lot of new initiatives that are blooming, which include both for-profit OER projects like Boundless Learning, which is actually here in Boston, which is focusing more or less on the textbook space. Wikipedia, we all know of its success overall. Peer-to-peer university, which is a way to continue to have peers come together and share open materials and to teach each other. And the Open Education Consortium, I know Mary Lou is here, which is really a follow-on and a build-on from the MIT OpenCourseWare. There's so many universities that wanted to do the same thing that MIT did, but they didn't understand the process. And the idea was to really create a community of universities who could come together and share kind of protocols and lessons learned overall. So focusing on MOOCs, I decided as I was thinking through this talk and really trying to compare OER and the open aspects to MOOCs, that it can be difficult because there really isn't a single definition of MOOCs, and there's a lot of variability. And particularly, I think if you look on the left-hand side of this slide, when the focus on the XMOOC or the CMOOC, where the XMOOC really focuses more on traditional models and scalability of those traditional models, and the CMOOC, which is much more on connectedness and community. And actually, the CMOOCs predated the XMOOCs, which is interesting, which is also an interesting part of this story. But it was really the XMOOCs that caught the world in some ways because of the scale and Times declaring it the year of the MOOC. But I think it was the beginning of the MOOC as opposed to the year of the MOOC because we have a lot of learning and evolution to move ahead. So just as you think about MOOCs, what does it mean? What is massive? What is massive to you versus massive to me? It can be endless, but is 1,000 massive, or does it have to be 50,000 or less? Is there open registration? Is it openly licensed or not? What does open mean in the context of a MOOC? Most are not openly licensed. A few are. Are there local cohorts? Do you blend? Are there meetups that come together around these MOOCs so that you actually have some of that interpersonal dynamic? Is it open entry? Are there start dates, end dates? Where's the badging, right? Badging is going to be another piece of these MOOCs. What does the certification look like? What does the badging look like? Could the badging be open? How do we think about that? Where is the learning community? And then is it free of charge? Is it affordable? Do you have to pay for certification, et cetera? So there's really quite a lot of variations in MOOC. So I was thinking about it, there's different variables. And I think it's important to call out because while there's significant major platforms, there's also smaller platforms as well that play in the MOOC space. And they are all experimenting with different models. And we don't yet know necessarily whether there'll be a singular model. I don't think so. I think there will be multiple models. But I think the models are important. Is it access, open access, or is it fee-based? Is it more of a constructivist, connectedness MOOC, or is it more of an X-MOOC? Or will they come together? Is it a nonprofit, or is it a for-profit? Is it open license? Does it have an open platform? We know edX is moving to open edX. What will that open platform mean? How will that evolve the space? Is there a certification at the end of mastery? Is there a fee for that certification? Is there institutional credit? Is there some sort of badging that's related? And what is the revenue model, and how might that be solved? So everyone's kind of jumping in very much like the Silicon Valley startups, gather a lot of users, we'll figure out the revenue model, but what will that be, and then what will the constraints be tied to that? So if we compare OER to most MOOCs, we know that OER is free and no cost. We know there's permission to reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute, which is central to the OER principles. So it really sits from public good, and the public has access to the content. Most MOOCs are free. Very few have kind of a low-end upfront cost, but most of them are free. But most of them are not openly licensed. Very few are openly licensed, so they don't carry an open license overall. And they're ventured back. Most of them are for-profit. edX is a nonprofit, but most are for-profit, and they seek revenue. So that is the end game for those MOOCs. So in thinking about this space, one challenge or one thought that I wanted to make sure everyone who participates can think about is the space between public domain and copyright and this ability to share. This is what MOOCs provide, this ability to share on scale. And universities and faculty are the copyright holders of their MOOC content. They design the content, you have your instructional designers, your pedagogy, you've worked hard, though you are the copyright holders. And the challenge we put forth to the MOOC platforms is that they think about providing a range of functionality with respect to the copyright, and that there be an option for MOOCs to make it easy for universities and faculty to add a Creative Commons license if they want to, if the copyright holders choose to do so. So right now, the platforms are restrictive, and they don't allow this option. And so this has actually been a conversation that's gone on for a while, and we also know that some of the universities would like to share their content more freely. Some of the faculty understand the value of that and understand the value proposition for it as well. So I think in thinking about MOOCs, one of the ways we're seeing a divergence with the open educational resource space is really the use of open licensing, and it's yet to play out what that will mean for the space going forward. This is an interesting figure from a JISC publication that focused on OER and MOOCs. And I thought it was interesting with respect to the timeline and how it kind of envisioned where the space had begun and really how it moved. So in the top left-hand corner, you see OER kind of at the center, being influenced by the open source software, which is very true. There was a lot that we learned from that community and many parallel efforts there. And open content, we called it the open content space initially. It became the OER initiative at Hewlett. Others have picked it up in different ways, in different forms, and really extended in significant ways. The Open University, OpenLearn spurred out of that. And at the same time, the MIT OpenCourseWare really spurred out of that as well. And if you look around 2008, you begin to see the CMOOCs emerging. This is Simons and Downs, who did one of the large initial CMOOCs where there was a lot of engagement, more facilitated, more guided, not using traditional methods online, but really using the opportunity of kind of open source and community and engagement to really lead and guide the instruction methodology. And these connectedness MOOCs continue. They continue to grow and they continue to evolve. They don't tend to have the scale of the X-MOOCs. But out of that, around 2010, you see the Stanford MOOC that begins to emerge, which kind of splits off into Udacity and to Coursera. And then there's also the Stanford MOOC that evolves, that begins to blend back in with MIT and the edX initiative. And so, and then just across the top, just to let you know, the Open University of the UK started an organization called FutureLearn. It's actually like a subsidiary of the OU UK. They kind of designed it away from the home university so it would have a lot of space for innovation, wouldn't be constrained by some of its early practices, but it includes both open content and proprietary content. So they've blended it together. They've taken some of their OpenLearn content and they added it to it as well. And then the other MOOC that I want to just call for people's attention is the Open Up Ed, and this is a pan-European MOOC effort that is being funded by the European Commission, and it's just underway. It really has the principles of openness in kind of almost all aspects of it, as far as I can understand of it at this point in time. It's going to have an open platform. It's going to rely on open licensing of the content. There'll be some sharing of the data. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting model to follow, to see how they learn, to see the experiments that come out of it, and how they begin to share their lessons learned. So I think this is a really interesting experiment in the MOOC space. When we think about the future, we've done a lot in open content, and that world hasn't finished, but it continues to evolve. And we know the value of the open platform, and I'm sure Anant will be speaking about that among with others, but that, that's incredible value and a value proposition to have it in an open platform for others to build on, for the community to come together, for not one organization have to create alone. But when we also think about the data, it's equally important. I thought Susan did a nice job, obviously, this morning, really pulling out the importance of the data and the lessons learned. So this is a great experimentation time where we're going to be able to collect data at scale. And then, so for me, when I think about openness and the data, I think about who owns the data, who will have access to the data, how will the data be shared so the whole community can learn from it. Is there a place where the data can be shared? Obviously, paying lots of attention to issues of privacy, making sure it's aggregated so we're not violating any individual's personal information. But is there a way that data can be shared? And then institutions, whether they're edX or Coursera or FutureLearn or OpenUpEd, can take that knowledge and can analyze that data and take some lessons learned maybe back to their home institution, because not everything needs to be shared. But there's going to be some rapid facilitation of the learning curve that could happen if we share the data in a much broader way. And so I think this is one of the very key issues that we haven't thought about as a community, and we haven't thought about how we create the scaffolding and structure to do that. Part of the work at Hewlett and other organizations like Hewlett is to create an innovative space where you can take risks. But it's also a place where you can look at the system level. Right? Most organizations have to think about their project, have to think about sustainability and staffing of their project. And so in thinking about the ecosystem and thinking about how this ecosystem will advance is really important to the collective good of everyone who's participating in the community. So I think, for me, I always use this term holy grail, I think this fully open cycle, which is what we've always had a vision of but hadn't quite always been able to articulate, and it will continue to evolve, would be part of this very open system that would work completely effectively for improving learning for our students across the globe. In this last slide, I think, again, it's from the GIST report. And I think it's important to really think about the value proposition and the role each of the institutions play in thinking about innovation and in thinking about measures of performance, which is along there on the x-axis, on the y-axis. Right? Time is on the y-axis, and we're moving along. And this really comes from Christensen's work in disruption. I'm aware my brother's here, and he picked me up at the airport late the other night, and he's in higher ed as well. And he said, I'm tired of hearing disruption in higher education. So I say this at the peril of seeing my brother again after this talk. So it's true, there's been so much hype, and we've all heard it. We're all exhausted from it. It's distracting. It isn't adding to the key issues we need to focus on with respect to learning. But in this analysis, what the sustaining innovation is really traditional universities, that solid line. And the traditional universities serve students who are usually in this kind of middle to high range, right? The ones who can afford, the ones who are active participants. It's not the non-participants that Susan's slide was so great at showing. All those highly accomplished students, but if they were low income, actually don't participate and go on into higher education. And this lower band at the bottom is non-consuming customers. These are people who are not involved in higher education because they don't have the opportunity, because they might not have the money, because they may have to go to work to support their parents and siblings. And also kind of to a comment to a question this morning, it tends to, and we should be thinking about people in other countries as well, right? So the take-up of MOOCs has been huge outside the US because this is an opportunity. They are non-consumers. There is not an opportunity for them to participate in higher education. And this is an avenue for them to be able to do that. And so if you look at the dotted line, it's really what they call the disruptive innovation. It tends to be technology-based. We now have that technology base for it. And disruptive innovations tend to come from new market players. There's not the traditional players, it's the new market players. And so that's the Coursera and the edX and OER, which is a new market player. And it begins initially in the lower band just to serve those non-consumers who don't have access. And it isn't always of the highest quality in the initial phases. It has to be revised, adapted, and improved. But as it continues to improve, it moves up in the market system and then becomes a disruptor overall. And so as we think, I think about the disadvantaged students, the students that don't have access. I'm really aware we're here at MIT, but in the United States, almost 50% of students go to community colleges. Very few students have the luxury of coming to a 4-year residential school. Many others would go maybe to the regional colleges, et cetera, but a 4-year residential program is pretty unique in the United States. And then to be able to participate in an elite university like MIT or Harvard or Stanford is really a very small percentage of higher ed. And I think in this country, when we talk about higher ed, for some reason, that's where our mind always goes. We don't go to the community college and the struggles and the innovations and the inability to help those students succeed. And I think what we have here is the opportunity with MOOCs, with open educational resources, with forms of disruption. We're beginning to disaggregate the bundle. How do we actually rebundle it in a way that's incredibly effective? And how do we do it not just to serve those students who are already being served and doing well, but actually bringing into the fold those students who do not have access to education and the opportunities that MIT students and others have as well. So as we think about our work, I think it's incredibly important to keep kind of the full range of students and learners involved. We're at the very beginning. It wasn't the year of the MOOC, it was the beginning of the MOOC or the beginning of the end of the MOOC. I'm not sure what it was in 2012, but we know this isn't the end of the story. OER has evolved over time. It will continue to evolve. We see governments picking it up. We see policies being implemented in countries across the globe. So there's a thirst and there's a need. And I think through openness, there's incredible innovation. There's avenues for serendipity. There's the ideas get picked up by people who can't come together physically to a meeting like this and continue to share and evolve. So as the MOOCs continue to grow and the experiments continue to grow, I think one of the important pieces is that it's not a walled garden and the data and the knowledge really get shared readily. And I think for the institutions who are participating in the MOOCs is to really think hard about what their value proposition is for that participation. For many of the institutions, higher education institutions, they're jumping in, they're teaching some courses on the MOOC because right now, essentially, it's trendy. It's a bit of branding, it's market extension, it opens up access. But are you going to be the solid line if you're an institution? Are you going to be a solid line? Well, there'll be marginal difference and marginal change, but it's really the platforms that will be pushing disruption. And then what will that mean for the future for everyone for higher education? So I think there are lots of questions yet to be answered, and I look forward to the conversations and discussion with the rest of the group for the next 2 days. And with that, I will open it up for questions. And I understand the mics are there, and the mics are important for the live streaming.
Hi, thank you very much. A wonderful talk. We've been big OER supporters at my institution. I'm at Penn State for many, many years. One of the big issues that we're running into with MOOCs is the big data that you spoke of. My college within the university has a strong OER philosophy that seemed to kind of fall apart when faculty were faced with opening up the data that they were collecting with the MOOCs they're teaching. All of a sudden, there was fear. We're a big research one institution. You know, if I let everyone else have access to this incredible data set that I've now got, you know, they'll all write papers that I should have been, you know, that I didn't get a chance to write. How can we help faculty be more open about sharing their data as they are with sharing their content?
Right, so I think, you know, that's a great question because it points to the institutional constraints in which people teach, and the tenure process exists. And the tenure process has been around for a long while, and it continues to be based on publications. And what we know is that actually there's a whole new set of metrics that institutions can begin to use to identify the value of that particularly faculty person to the larger knowledge ecosystem. So as an example, I will cite like Rich Baranek, who was the founder of the Connections Project. He was a young faculty member. He was in dynamics and engineering. He knew the publishers wanted him to write a textbook. He knew by the time he wrote it and it was published that the data would be out of date. Digital signal processing changes way too fast, particularly at that time. So he wanted to put it out into the world and let people use it and rebundle it. So he was a young faculty member. He took a risk because he wasn't going to have that textbook, even though a publisher had come to him. But what he was able to say is it had been downloaded like 250,000 times, it had been translated into 12 languages. So the metrics of what we use now in institutional tenure processes needs to morph as part of the system. On the data, I thought your question was going first one way and then one another. So first I thought, oh, was that faculty member worried about what the data says about that course? So you say no, which is fine. We need space to fail. We need space to improve. It's going to be continual cycles of it. And I think on the larger issue data, it goes back to the publishing process. So there are, and I'm not thinking of the name, but there's a project out of UK where the scientists began to come together to share data as a community. And there were these concerns about when do I share data and when don't I? And what they realized is that faculty often in their content domains, their best thought partners aren't always in the same institution. They're in another institution anyway. So it created this rapid cycle for actually sharing the data and from being able to still analyze it. So while others might also be able to analyze the data, the idea would be there would be more data than one individual could possibly collect. And then let me just add a little bit on that spiel, is that who owns that data set? These data sets are sitting on people's hard drives. They're sitting in institutional offices, and they've been paid for by the public. When we think about the National Science Foundation and the money that goes into research, and then it gets duplicated again and again. And it's not an efficient use of resources. We're not actually being able to move the system as quickly as we can. So when we think about data sets, it's long been held tight just for the reasons you described. But if you can imagine if we can create incentives to open that up and to acknowledge that faculty member as a contributor, then we can really move the ball in a significant way. Thank you.
Question over here. Over this way.
Hi. Hi there.
Hi, Karen Stahlberg from the University of Michigan. I wanted to thank you for bringing open out into the open in this discussion. Because I think we have a language issue between asynchronous online electronic education and the true global good that is an open educational resource. And the one thing I would also encourage us to recognize is that it's a two-way street. And so the challenge that many of us face in a highly westernized and highly resource-rich environment is the risk of colonialization, right? Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that I have personally benefited from having all of my MOOC in an open educational resource and a Creative Commons license, mm-hmm. and having the opportunity to learn from other people around the globe, mm-hmm. about their best practices. And I live in a medical education environment, mm-hmm. And a healthcare environment, and so it's really humbling to recognize that You don't have to keep it for yourself because there are millions of people who are just as smart and just as capable and as excited as we are about this space. So I just wanted to say thank you.
You're welcome. So let me ask you a question then. Are there any downsides that you experienced to opening your content?
The downside was in the preparation and making sure that everything was copyright clean.
That's
so making sure that I went to the Creative Commons license space, or if there were images that I wanted to use, that I made sure they were clean. The other thing that's a challenge that I found was providing online educational resources because obviously many people don't have access to the libraries that we do, or if you quote an article or a textbook, they can't just download it for free. So making sure that any references I used, I actually obtained from an open site so that it could stay open was important in my design.
That's great. Very, very helpful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sash Thackberry from Cuyahoga Community College. I actually met you before. My question is, we did a MOOC for developmental education in math, like really, really basic pre-algebra stuff. And one of the challenges, we went into it thinking, oh, there's going to be OER for this all over the place. And there was some great content. Very little of that content was designed for our audience. So a lot of that content that you all in this room probably use all the time is fantastic content, much higher level content than we could use. And then there's also a lot at the K-12 level, right? So there's a lot at the K-12 level, but it's not really designed for a non-traditional learner. And because the reach of what we can do at the community college level is so huge, but it's also like a non-networked audience. So our audience doesn't go about finding about a MOOC by going to edX or going to Coursera. We're explaining to people what a MOOC is, and sometimes we're having that conversation institutionally. What is a MOOC? Why are we doing a MOOC? What can a MOOC do for us? So my question is, do you know of any efforts in order to translate some of the content, you know, that the remixing process and republishing process is so time intensive? And I didn't know if there were any initiatives you knew about or any kind of projects moving forward that's looking at taking the fantastic content and like breaking it down so that it would be for a less traditional sort of, you know, someone who already has a master's degree and is going back to get some of that, you know, additional professional development.
Right. So I think you've kind of hit the nail on one of the challenges is that some of the content isn't yet even easily discoverable when it carries a Creative Commons license. And that was partly a decision early on from the Creative Commons that actually the internet is the commons. It's the public place where content lives. And at that time, there weren't walled gardens. So we expected that the search engines would actually make it easy to retrieve. Actually, if you go to Google and you go to an advanced search, you can actually search for Creative Commons licensed content, so it makes it easier to find, but we haven't completely solved that problem. And I remember where I met you in DC, I believe, and I'm going to point you also to Paul Stacy of Creative Commons, who you've probably worked with, because there is a fair amount of content there, and there is targeted to different audiences. But instead of always having to start from scratch, if you could take some of that content and actually tweak it for your particular audience. I should also say that there's a lot of movement in the United States around the K-12 and the Common Core, because the Common Core now creates a spine where you can actually map the OER content to the objectives, the learning objectives. And so I think we're going to be seeing, particularly in math and sciences, an early release of OER content that then, again, because of the power of it is that you don't have to start from scratch, you can take it and build on it from there. So math has been around for a long time. I think actually Paul would probably be able to identify most of the resources, and I just want to acknowledge Paul Stacy, who's part of the education team at Creative Commons, a longtime colleague and supporter of OER from his early days in British Columbia, who's a fount of knowledge about this as well.
I wanted to, first of all, thank you for your work in this area.
Thank you.
I think of all the discussions here, this is the most important one. It's the only one where it's a question of if and not when, and I really appreciate this. I had a question about legal frameworks. Creative Commons was a wonderful framework a decade ago. It started to fray a little bit with OLI, where there was open content on a closed platform, so in fact could not reuse it. It started to fray very heavily, go from fraying to almost collapsing in MOOCs, where things like graders, things like that, simply having access to a MOOC doesn't mean you can pull the content out, reuse it, and remix it. There are a lot of more nuanced issues, such as, can I take your course and set up a website that just gives students answers to it? As it's moving from low stakes into high stakes assessments, from things like videos to things like student projects, grade assignments, exams, the legal frameworks really haven't kept up. Do you know if there's an initiative to update the legal frameworks, or is Hewlett working on this problem?
Yeah, so I think that's a very valid point. So just from the legal framework side, even in the Creative Commons side, we just versioned up to 4.0 of a license. And so part of that was because the licenses were being ported into each country, and it still meant it could be shared, and the license has been held valid in court of law across countries, but it was a little messy and it didn't deal with data well. So Creative Commons went through a 2-year versioning process with the global community. And they've come up with the international license that now spans across the globe. And it deals with sui generis rights and data, which is particularly a European issue. So that's part of the continued evolution of the license. It always has to evolve. On the data side, Candace and I have had some conversations about this. One of the most recent ones, when she came and asked me to participate in this meeting, was we were both sitting there saying, how did we make the mistake in some ways with that early grant to OLI? Like, why didn't we think about the open source platform? Because we were focused on the content, and we both agree that we couldn't then have seen where we are now. And that's just kind of a reality, that we were trying to focus on the learning design. And even Hewlett as a foundation didn't have it as a process to figure out how to write in its grants about requiring things be made open educational resources. Within our grant process, early in the days of OER, I would have faculty at other institutions say, you've got to change your letter and make sure it requires the university to keep this open, because otherwise folks at the university will try to clamp it down. So there's been a whole process going to that question of constraints about what it means. We now know just what you described, that if the content is open but you can't move it, if it's not interoperable, if you can't move it to another platform, then it's open access in many ways, right? And so now, how do we blend those worlds together? Candace is working on that at Stanford. She's working to bring that in her piece to Open edX as well. And then the last part of your question is around assessments, which has been another conversation. So part of the conversation is now this move towards open assessments. Sometimes assessments are going to have to be held so that the public doesn't have them. Those tend to be the high stakes assessments. Even when we heard Susan this morning, we also heard a lot of emphasis on the formative assessment, that immediate feedback. But we can create other assessments, and there's actually a project that Hewlett has funded for a competitive system about creating open assessments. So I think you're beginning to see some movement in that space. And I think the question is how we take all these different elements and how we blend them to create a coherent system that is seamless and interoperable. So I guess stay tuned and continue to be a supporter and help us solve that problem, let me say. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
Sorry, actually, Mark Lester from FutureLearn, just in the middle, to the right of the camera.
Yes.
Hi there. Again, thank you very much. As you mentioned, FutureLearn was founded by the British Open University, so there's a strong commitment to openness. I thought the first thing I wanted to say was just a clarification, which is actually we do permit universities to publish their materials under a Creative Commons license on the platform. So that feature is there, you'll be pleased to know. In Sortley, we'll be making all our delivered content, that means the videos, articles, that they will be open, shareable, and discoverable.
Great.
So I hope that's a useful contribution to this. But one of the challenges that our universities obviously face is, and it's been mentioned here already, securing high-quality content that's usually locked up in licenses. Is there anything that you're working on with anybody else or we can all do to try and free up more of that content? Because I think that's a huge barrier to some of the goals that I think we all have.
So on the quality content, and I know OpenLearn has been, in the UK, has been really one of the early designers about really the high quality content. So I would say that the world has changed and content is everywhere. And so my take on this is that we continue to use resources to develop similar content. Content will differ, it needs to evolve, it needs to be maintained, it needs to be corrected, is Pluto a planet or not. But we don't always have to start from scratch, right? We've got like every state developing an algebra class. Algebra hasn't changed that much. We could use those resources for teachers. We could use it for students. We could use it for some of the data mining, right? So one of the questions is, how does the community feel about coming together and sharing that content? And what would that look like? I mean, so, you know, and there's also a business model, because I don't think everyone can continue to develop the highest quality content, because it's very expensive. OU UK was the highest by far in what they spent per course. I know it was like a 5-year cycle, and the content, the way the faculty sat around, very, very high quality. So in this new age, what does it mean? And is the value proposition around the creation of the content, or around some of the other norms of support and certification and credentialing? And so I don't have an answer to that. Our answer, Mike's answer and I in the early days, is we wanted to create up a switching station, right? We wanted to create a pool where people would all contribute and say, hey, I've developed this, and let me put it in, and you've developed that, let me use what you have. But we still have this instinct not to use what someone else has created. Because if I create it myself, it will be better. I'm going to say it again. If I create it myself, it will be better. And we don't know that. There's no empirical evidence to that. So we need to share. What we develop as a group will be better. I think we can all say that for sure. And so if there's some energy around this, happy to brainstorm on some ideas. Gentleman here.
Yeah, my question is about, with all this content around and in open educational resources, but when I read the National Research Council things, they're all saying you should use research-based content. It's much more, you should use research-based pedagogy. It's much more effective. How do we get from where we have this huge library of quality educational resources developed largely by people who are ignorant of the education research literature and techniques? How do we get from there to where people are actually using stuff that is demonstrated to be efficacious by research?
Right, and I think that's exactly the right question, and I think that's the right question whether it's open or not, right? How do we get everyone to use the content that is of research quality? And I think that's very much the same in the OER space. I think the content we'll create systems so that we need to do more efficacy studies. We have some coming out of the Open Research Hub, which is actually at the OU UK, and that will be released in the early 2015. But we also need to understand, to build that research much more. And then let the community, too, kind of like bump up what's really effective and kind of let us get rid of content that isn't working effectively. If we can share it more readily, we can also access it, and teachers and faculty can use that much more readily. There's a whole culture, though, and I say this at MIT, standing in front of a lecture hall, is that the reason a lecture hall got created wasn't for pedagogical efficacy. It was because it was a way to scale a one-to-one tutoring or a small tutoring session, which isn't to say that a large lecture hall isn't effective sometimes, but how do I know I've even been effective in this talk? Where's the research data about that? And we continue to replicate these very traditional norms where we now have the opportunity with the computational power, with the data mining, to really refine it. So then the question is, how do we actually refine it? How do we get people to understand it and to use it? And how do we spread that as a norm? When Chuck Vest came to Hewlett with the MIT OpenCourseWare, it wasn't just about opening the window so people could peer into MIT. It was fundamentally, and he always spoke about this, it was about improving teaching and learning. It was always at the core that he wanted to bring that back to MIT, and while he was doing that, he was also helping to serve the mission of MIT. And so I think in this way, in the efficacy studies, in the research, so I think wherever Susan is, she has a lot of work on her agenda around how do we use NSF dollars to really continue to push this as well. Yes. Oh, okay, very good. Thank you, everyone.
So before you leave, I want to say a little bit about what we have arranged for you for tonight. So we have this amazing program arranged at John F. Kennedy Museum. It's a really unique place in New England. So if you haven't been there, you should come. And at the beginning, we have a reception for all of you to get to know each other. The quick hits you submitted, we'll have that presented there. And also to help everybody communicate, we have some drink tickets, so you can actually we'll help this process in there. Followed that, we have a really great panel set up that have Anand from edX, and Vivek Goyal from Coursera, Melissa Loeb from Canvas, Mark Lester from FutureLearn, moderated by Diana Opplinger from Educate. So I think that will be probably a great highlight for this entire conference. This is a place that you can ask all these questions you want to ask from these people, and hopefully they will give you great answers. So that will be very interesting panel. And that followed by another New England icon, we'll have a clam bake. So if you haven't signed up for the dinner, we have about, I think, 10 tickets left. So first come, first serve basis, you can go purchase a ticket from the counter. I don't want to leave any tickets unpurchased. So I hope to see you all. And the buses will start leaving here promptly, starting at 5. So make sure we have the sessions ended, and then the buses will be out in the front. So don't miss the bus. If you miss the bus, it's a horrific commute to get to the JFK Museum.